and welcome to today's webinar. Our speaker today is Michael Noble, Vice President of Global Marketing at Senzime. At this time, all lines have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise. We will have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. You can type your question using the question prompt. They'll be answered in the order they were received. When typing your questions, please identify the name of your organization at the beginning of your entry. Also, as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be available in the CIHQ YouTube library within a few days. It's now my pleasure to turn the conference over to our presenter, Michael Noble. Michael, you have the floor.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you for those who are here with us today. It is quite an honor, and especially thank Michelle and the CIHQ organization for having me here as a guest speaker here. So yeah, as you can see on the title here, we're here to cover, are you compliant, and what the latest guidelines mean for neuromuscular monitoring. And before I go any further, I just want to highlight that I work for Senzime. We are a quantitative neuromuscular monitoring company and so much more. And just a little bit about my background. I have been in medical devices for 16 years and counting. It's been an amazing ride so far, starting with Cochlear with implantable hearing devices to Medtronic for patient monitoring, and now Senzime with our respiratory and anesthesia monitoring portfolio and solutions that we have. And so if we go to the next slide here, and it looks like I'm having some technical challenges here. So let me just readjust the screen share so I'll show the next slides. Okay, and let me see if I can get this into full presentation mode. Okay, it looks like it has disappeared. So let me reshare this again. Okay. It is not cooperating, so hang on one second. Let me just reset this PowerPoint. Okay. Hopefully this will work now. Nope, it just did it again. Okay, apologies. It looks like it will not cooperate with the full presentation mode, so you'll see it like this. So I'm going to just zoom in here, and we'll make the best of it given the technical challenges. But thank you for bearing with us for just 1 second. So for this particular webinar, the objectives and kind of the overarching goal that you probably saw in the sign up is we really want to move from monitoring as optional to making monitoring really being a quality, safety, and compliance requirement. And it's absolutely critical for patient safety because our shared goal, I think anyone would agree, is we want to help keep patients as safe as possible. So in the theme of Train of 4, where we have 4 things, the 4 things we'll cover and unpack throughout this webinar is, first, we want to understand the clinical risk associated with residual neuromuscular block or residual paralysis and the impact it has on patient outcomes. Then we'll move into reviewing what the current guideline recommendations have to say as it relates to quantitative neuromuscular monitoring. And then we'll move into, okay, we know the guidelines, we understand the clinical risk associated with residual paralysis. Are there any gaps that exist between the guidelines and to real world? What is currently happening when it comes to clinical practice? Then we'll conclude with, okay, now let's talk about how do we practically and efficiently implement quantitative neuromuscular monitoring consistent with those guideline recommendations across perioperative workflows. So we have a lot to cover in just 45 minutes, and at the very end, we'll have Q&A. So we'd love to hear your questions. So use that question mark little icon in your GoToWebinar and send those questions, and we'll cover those towards the end. So who we are. We are Senzime, and it is one of the best, I think, companies that are there And what I really like about Senzime is we are a global company, and we essentially, sorry, it looks like it is not advancing the slides here. So let me toggle this. Okay. All right, hopefully this will do the trick. Okay, let me just move this here. Yep, okay, so now we're seeing it. So who is Senzime? So we are a global medical device company, and we are headquartered in Uppsala, which is a university town in Sweden. And what I love about Uppsala, it is a very forward progressive city in terms of the latest technology, life sciences, research. So we have access to a really good knowledge there in that team. And the cool thing about Uppsala and our Senzime presence is we are across over 30 different countries, with the United States being one of our largest markets, and of course, Western Europe. And we have the sole mission of really eliminating respiratory complications following anesthesia through our algorithm-driven monitoring solutions. And the market opportunity that we have and the patients that we serve, there are over 100 million patients every single year across the globe who undergo surgery and need this extra layer of patient safety and monitoring. And so when we look at our vision is really straightforward. We envision this world where every clinician is empowered and every patient assured. Every time I read that, I get goosebumps. And our mission statement is our really guiding principle of all we do at Senzime. And with our mission, we really want to revolutionize perioperative care with the end goal of safeguarding every patient's journey from anesthesia to recovery. So just to give you a little context of what we do and how we support quantitative neuromuscular monitoring before we go into those 4 objectives. So this is our flagship monitor. It's called the Next Generation Tetrograph. It is powered by this operating system, which consists of many different proprietary algorithms that we fine-tuned over 40 years of research, really based on our inventor, Dr. Soren Brohl, who is an anesthesiologist from Mayo. And so we were able to take his incredible invention of the tetrograph to really help keep patients safe. And so with this next generation, you can see here, this is called the level of block gauge, this round thing where you see the 90% of train to 4 ratio. That's where the guidelines really highlight to confirm neuromuscular monitoring or neuromuscular recovery when you're using neuromuscular blocking agents is you want to get to that acceptable recovery period, meaning it's safe to extubate the patient at the end of the surgery so they can leave the operating room and you can have the confidence they can breathe on their own. Because if you don't confirm that they can breathe on their own, that can develop what we call respiratory compromise, and that can lead into respiratory failure. And a worst case scenario, that can lead to full-on cardiac arrest and, of course, respiratory failure for that patient. So the way this system works is you have a sensor that you place on the patient. It can be done on the hand, along the ulnar nerve for the stimulating electrodes. You can put on the ADM or AP muscle, 2 different locations. If you don't have access to the hand or arm, we also offer a foot placement along the tibial nerve. And what I love about this monitor is it's not just giving you data for just one point within the procedure and the OR. It is giving you clinical decision-making support with this objective quantitative neuromuscular data all the way from intubation to extubation. So that's who we really are, and this is the type of solution that we have to offer. So when we go into the clinical problem, as one of the first pillars of the 4 we mentioned earlier, is let's understand the risk. Why do we even care about neuromuscular monitoring, and what is the clinical problem we're trying to solve for? And it really comes down to this one thing, residual paralysis, or sometimes we call it residual neuromuscular block. And that has a heavy, huge impact on patient outcomes. So let's quantify exactly how big of an issue is residual paralysis. So the literature tells us that the incidence of RNMB, residual neuromuscular block, is as much as 33%. So 1/3 of all procedures receiving neuromuscular blocking agents have residual paralysis when they move into recovery. And when that happens, these patients go from the operating room to the post-anesthesia care unit, PACU for short. And we have seen literature saying that for patients who have residual paralysis, their length of stay can increase on average of 80 minutes. And we know a lot of hospitals or even ambulatory surgery centers is all about that faster throughput. So the last thing you want is patients staying longer in the PACU. And of course, even worse, if it does develop into some type of respiratory compromise, you could have ICU transfers. And we have found that using true EMG-based quantitative neuromuscular monitoring, you can reduce ICU admissions threefold. And also, oftentimes when you have residual neuromuscular block, usually that comes from having residual effects of the neuromuscular blocking agent, the most common one being rocuronium. Now, there's two ways patients can recover from neuromuscular blocking agents. It is either spontaneous recovery, they can just clear it out on their own, or the anesthesiologist may administer a reversal agent, the most common one being sugammadex. And we'll talk a little bit more about sugammadex. But we have found with the clinical literature is if you have a true quantitative neuromuscular monitoring to help with not only giving the right dose of rocuronium or the neuromuscular blocking agent, but also the reversal. And we have found that patients even need less than they're being administered. So with that data, you can reduce drug cost, which of course, hospitals are always tasked with finding ways to reduce costs where possible. But the most important thing and the number one priority for this clinical problem is we want to improve patient safety. And that is done through EMG-based monitoring, consistent and compliant with the ASA guidelines. And we'll talk about what that looks like in a moment. So when we think about, okay, well, which patients and how often does this occur? So across the world, there are about 160 million surgeries being performed every single year. And out of those procedures, 100 million are receiving neuromuscular blocking agents or basically paralyzing drugs, meaning you eliminate all muscle movement, which really helps with improving surgical conditions, especially in cases like robotic surgeries or laparoscopic procedures. And out of those numbers, or 100 million surgeries, we have found that 30 million have residual paralysis, so almost that 1/3 that we talked earlier. And about 1 million of those surgeries can become life-threatening because they are just simply not monitored appropriately. So what is the solution? It all comes back to having a good, true quantitative neuromuscular monitoring protocol, whether you're at an acute care hospital setting or an ambulatory surgery center. So when we think about the train of foreign twitches, so basically the way the monitor works, if you're not familiar, is you're stimulating the ulnar nerve and you're getting 4 successive twitches, and then you're taking the ratio of the first and the last twitch. So that's where you get these percentages. And when you get down to train of 4 count 0, that's when you're going into deep block. And then we have a thing called post-tetanic count, and that's when you're going into deep to profound neuromuscular block, meaning there's absolutely no muscle movement. And a lot of surgeons request from anesthesiologists that there's no muscle movement in cases like robotics and laparoscopic procedures. And the data has shown that when you are anywhere at 90% and below, you're not necessarily getting that full recovery to make sure that you have a nice open airway and that the patient has the muscle movement and the lung able to breathe on their own when they are extubated. And oftentimes when you're not using an objective quantitative neuromuscular monitor, a lot of these patients can and often do go into the PACU with train of 4 ratios anywhere from 40 to like 70%. And those are at high risk of developing respiratory compromise. And the only way to know is if you have a true objective quantitative neuromuscular monitoring. And currently the most common practice we see today is anesthesia providers are using peripheral nerve stimulators. And you're physically looking at clinical signs, and that's very subjective. So we want to take all of that subjectivity out of the equation and provide that true objective data. The other data point and study that I always like to share is this one, where it shows the MRI of the airway. And so as you can see, before the patient receives any neuromuscular blocking agents, they have that nice, big, clear, open airway. And that's when you're going to have that 100% train of 4 ratio because you haven't received any of the blocking agents. Now, when you're at 50%, you can see that airway is completely narrow. And that's when you're still getting 4 twitches. So you think, oh, well, maybe the patient's recovering. But no, when you look at their ratio, they're at 50%. And same thing at 80%. That airway is not fully open like you see before they receive neuromuscular blocking agents. And then you see that the fourth picture here where you have the widening of that airway. And so they're now able to really breathe on their own. But even if you just wait another 15 minutes, at that 100% train to fur ratio, it still opens up. And so the main takeaway message I want you to see from these MRI images is that these degrees of muscle relaxation across 50, 80, and so on percent, you would never be able to objectively identify that sort of open airway unless you have this quantitative neuromuscular monitor. The next thing that I like to show here is this different ways of detecting residual paralysis. So oftentimes the most common subjective test or assessments is looking at the head lift or looking at the hand grip or even having your tongue protrusion. And what's interesting is a lot of these sort of abilities are lost between that 40 and 70% range. And that's important because you're not going to be able to see if they're in that range unless you have this quantitative neuromuscular monitor. And it becomes increasingly clear that you want to have a ratio at that 90% or greater when you can have that confidence that the patient can breathe on their own. And it's really looking at that upper airway is what they really need to have. This other slide here that we have is from another study, and it shows the ability of patients to clear the neuromuscular blocking agents on their own or spontaneously. And the take-home message is, as you can see on the bottom, the time it takes to clear and get to that 100% or even 90% train to fur ratio. And every patient reacts differently. Some can take up to 400 minutes. A lot of people are here, in that 100 to 200 minutes. And the point is, you don't know how that patient's going to react and how they're going to be able to spontaneously recover, or do they need that reversal? So every patient's different. And the best way to know is if you have this monitor to objectively see what their train to fur ratio is. This particular study is from Thielen et al. And I love this study because it looked at a study of 189 patients who used or received neuromuscular blocking agents, and then they were reversed with either Sagamedex or neostigmine using a quantitative neuromuscular monitoring. And the coolest data point out of this study is showed that 0% of patients that had quantitative neuromuscular monitoring had residual paralysis. So basically, you're eliminating that clinical problem completely with a monitor. So it all goes back to having that objective data because you don't really know, and it's just that extra layer to help assess the patient. And the other interesting thing is, as I alluded to earlier, this study also highlighted that using a neuromuscular monitoring also saved on reversal drug costs, most notably Sagamedex, because oftentimes patients are receiving way more than they need. And in some cases, they don't even need a reversal, but you wouldn't know unless you had that monitor to see where they are in terms of recovery using the train to fur ratio. Okay, now, when we talk about quantitative neuromuscular monitoring, for those new to this, there are essentially two different types. There's the older traditional technology called AMG, or acceleromyography. And the way that works is it relies on the physical twitching of the muscles. And with basically the twitches, you need to be able to have full access to that arm. Well, if you're tucking the arms in like a robotic case, it's going to restrict that movement. So you're not going to be able to see truly always. In those cases, their true train to fur ratio in this case. Now with EMG, which is what we provide, is electromyography. And the coolest thing about EMG technology is you're getting the readings from the compound muscle action potential, CMAP for short. And basically you're getting the measurement before the twitch even happens. So you can tuck those arms all day and always get the reading. And you don't even need to physically look at the arm to twitches to get your ratio. The monitor is going to do all of that reading and measuring for you. Okay, so here, just to kind of highlight some of the advantages of going to EMG from AMG or other types of quantitative neuromuscular monitoring. We have found that EMG-based monitoring is going to be a lot more accurate. And it's got more accuracy and precision with 4 times higher resolution, for example. And also, it's independent of limb movement, so you can tuck those arms all day long and have no issues. And you're always going to get a reading directly on the monitor. And the cool thing about our monitoring solution is it has seamless integration with the hospital's multi-parameter monitors to their electronic health records, all of those things, so that you're not having to manually chart. And you can also get the data that you need to show measurable improvement in those patient outcomes, like reduction in ICU transfers, reduced use of Sugamidex. All of those different things can really help you if you can get that data integrated. And the other piece is, okay, well, all right, you say that the guidelines say, and we need to have quantitative neuromuscular monitoring. Does it really improve patient outcomes? What are some of those patient outcome data points you can look at? So when we look at different ICD-10 codes, and this study highlighted looking at some of these codes is they were able to reduce post-operative pulmonary complications by 43% with quantitative neuromuscular monitoring, confirming that 90% train-to-for ratio. They were able to reduce hospital length of stay from 3 to 2 days, and even reduce the PACU length of stay across the board by at least 5 minutes using these data points. So it's really helping your bottom line, whether you're at the acute care hospital setting or even the ambulatory surgery center. It's going to help reduce any of those respiratory related, especially post-operative pulmonary complications. So now we've talked about the clinical problem and why it's important and why we should care about it, whether you're at a hospital or at an ASC. So let's talk about the guidelines for a minute and what that means for your practice. So over the years, starting in 2010, we saw a huge increase in uptake of more and more guidelines being published, and it's still continuing even this year. But it really all started back in 2010 with the Helsinki Declaration on Patient Safety and Anesthesiology. And then fast forward to 2023, which I think was a huge inflection point in the neuromuscular monitoring space, is with the introduction of the American Association of Anesthesiologists, or ASA for short, guidelines. And even the European Society of Anesthetists issued similar guidelines saying you need to have quantitative neuromuscular monitoring and confirm that 90% train-to-for ratio to confirm recovery when you're using neuromuscular blocking agents like rocuronium. Now, when they say quantitative neuromuscular monitoring, that can mean AMG or EMG, and we highlighted the difference earlier. The reason I call that out is fast forward to 2026, the European Society for Pediatric Anesthesiology took it a step further and said, don't just use any quantitative neuromuscular monitoring, use electromyography-based or EMG-based for short, because it is more accurate and it's going to even work on those smaller patients with those smaller hands that an AMG monitor is just not going to be able to do as well. So that's very important to highlight. Now, the guidelines, what exactly do they say? So in the ASA guidelines, they really encourage healthcare systems to introduce quantitative neuromuscular monitoring, same technology that we have to offer anytime patients undergo anesthesia and receive those muscle relaxants or neuromuscular blocking agents. And the new guidelines not only say we recommend it, but we also say that there's strong evidence that the complications as a result of residual paralysis are widely underestimated. And many patients are awakened and extubated while still exhibiting those effects of neuromuscular blocking agents with neuromuscular weakness, post-operative pulmonary complications, unpleasant recall, longer hospital stays, even delayed return to daily activities. And so we really designed this tetrograph to not only be innovative and help improve patient safety, but also make it easier for hospitals and ASCs to meet those guidelines and follow those practice recommendations, removing as much friction as possible within the workflow, because we know that is a change in clinical practice. And it does impact to a certain point, the workflow, so we try to make that as easy as possible. So when we think about the ASA guidelines, kind of going back to that Thailand study, that they found when you use quantitative neuromuscular monitoring, following those ASA guidelines to help guide reversal, or even if you need reversal, they found that those patients receiving monitoring had no paralysis after surgery, because you're objectively measuring that patient. And what's really interesting is 17% didn't even need a reversal. And those who do receive a reversal, we have found, and I'll show that data point later, they're receiving too much Senzime or reversal agent. And that can result in some adverse effects. And I really like that they highlighted the protocol of how they manage those neuromuscular blocking agents and how they reverse it using a neuromuscular monitor. So this is a great asset and resource to have if you're implementing that change in your clinical practice. And I kind of alluded to this earlier. So earlier this year, in 2026, the European Society of Pediatric Anesthesiology took that a step further and said, anytime you're using a neuromuscular blocking agent, don't just use any type of quantitative neuromuscular monitoring, but here are their direct words: recommending quantitative monitoring with EMG, electromyography based, rather than AMG based devices, due to higher accuracy and the reliability of decurization monitoring. That's really compelling. So this is really becoming the new clinical standard when it comes to neuromuscular management. So we talked about the clinical problem and why that has a huge impact on patient safety and also your quality metrics. We talked about the practice guidelines and what they have to say. But what does the real world tell us? Are people following the guidelines? Are there any gaps? And why are there gaps if there are gaps? So let's start with the study that recently came out. So this study looked at a survey that was sent to the ASA members, and they highlighted a pretty sobering practice gap, despite these guidelines coming out just 3 years ago. And what the data tells us from the survey is 53% never use quantitative monitoring to confirm recovery. Again, let that sink in. 53% never use quantitative neuromuscular monitoring. And we know 1/3 of patients receiving neuromuscular blocking agents have residual paralysis. Only 19% use quantitative monitoring consistently. 61% reported no change in use since those guidelines came out. 55% unfortunately reported no quantitative monitors in any anesthetizing locations. And what's even more interesting is only 6% were unaware of the guidelines. So what this tells us is awareness is not necessarily the main barrier. It really is implementation. So what is it about the implementation that is making it harder to follow those guidelines? So this is what the survey also told us. So the survey tells us that what really drives the gap that we see is access. When quantitative neuromuscular monitoring was unavailable, 86% never used it. So obviously we need to get more monitors into these operating theaters. Workflow, that is a very, very hard thing to change, especially when you've been using technology for a long time and there's a perception that it may work. But as we know with the guidelines and the strong evidence, not so much. You really need to have a quantitative neuromuscular monitor. And 65% of those respondents say they still use the old school peripheral nerve stimulator, which is like a 2-prong little case module. And they're often using it on the forehead, especially when those arms are tucked or draped, because you're not going to have access to the arms. And there are tons of evidence and literature that says that is not the most accurate way to monitor the patient. The other piece is around culture. Private practice respondents reported the highest never used rate at 75%. More academic institutions have adopted quantitative neuromuscular monitoring, but private practice just hasn't quite caught up. And one of the biggest misconceptions out there is a lot of people use Senzime, And again, Senzime is a reversal agent for those muscle relaxants. And I will say Senzime is a great, awesome tool to use and absolutely should be used. However, it needs to be used with quantitative neuromuscular monitoring, and 57% they say use Senzime without a monitor. And the most common manufacturer of Senzime is Residual by Merck, and they have in their instructions for use to use a quantitative neuromuscular monitor. So this is not just a nice to have, even the manufacturer recommends using that monitor. So the implication is we need to change that sort of misconception that Senzime is to substitute, that you don't need to have a monitor if using Senzime, and that is not true. It's even more so the reason that you need to have a neuromuscular monitoring so that you can have the right dosing of that reversal. And in some cases, you may not even need a reversal for that patient. So let's talk about that for a second. There is another study. It's kind of the Goldilocks and the 3 rocuronium reversals. And what was fascinating about this study, it found that 87% of patients received less than the recommended dose of Senzime, whereas 13% of patients needed more. So if you do a little quick math, 87 plus 13 is 100%. So 100% of the patients were not receiving the right dose. In fact, some patients, again, don't even need a reversal necessarily. And so this study concluded, because of those data points, that a quantitative neuromuscular monitor is essential to ascertain that adequate reversal has taken place so that you can make sure you're getting that 90% or greater 3:4 ratio for neuromuscular recovery. The other thing too is sometimes there's a misconception that Senzime is perfectly safe. There's no issues, even if you give them more than they need. And that's not necessarily true. There was a newsletter that came out about a year, or it was January 2025, highlighting the potential adverse effects of Senzime. And it really came down to these 5 categories. There was all cases of bradycardia reported, and the worst case leading to arrest. That's very important to know about. Secondly is anaphylaxis. There were some severe cases linked to both that rocuronium neuromuscular blocking agent as well as the Senzime complex. Coagulation changes that were dose dependent. Hormonal interaction. If you have a patient that is on contraceptives, usually anesthesia has to inform them that it may lose the effect of that contraception following Senzime. And then there's these special population considerations, like those with pregnancy uncertainty effects, renal failure patients, even pediatrics, and then of course bradycardia risk. So you want to make sure that you are not overdosing, and you definitely want to mitigate as much risk as you can as it relates to adverse effects as a result of Senzime. Now, the other study that came out of Colorado Children's, and they looked at potentially even taking a step further and aliquoting. So traditionally, Senzime come in these 200 milligram vials, and when you aliquot, you're basically doing these 50 smaller increments, and you're not having to do a full vial. And as we saw in the previous literature, that 87% are receiving too much Senzime. And so you cannot necessarily reduce or get the right dose unless you have an objective quantitative neuromuscular monitoring, because you want to make sure that patient's getting to that 90%. So with that neuromuscular monitoring, they're able to reduce overall Senzime use and spend, which led to, if you extrapolate the potential saving, $370,000. And also there were some cases, again, where you didn't even use Senzime, and that contributed to 40% of the total savings by not having to use Senzime at all. But none of that is possible without having the neuromuscular monitor. So now I know we just covered a lot of ground, and we know the clinical problem, residual paralysis. We know the guidelines say you need to have quantitative neuromuscular monitoring, with one even saying EMG based. And then now we know, well, guidelines have been out, but not everyone is necessarily doing it. Why is that? It comes back to implementation, changing the workflow. So this is where we can really help. and have a really well thought out implementation program. So one of the key things is going back to the why. Why do we care about changing and having a new clinical practice change into the workflow? And it goes back to these three main things. Safety, we want to reduce residual neuromuscular block because we know that can happen in 11.3% of deep block cases where you have residual paralysis. The guidelines say it, so you want to make sure you're compliant and mitigate any potential exposure or risk should you be audited or forbid there's an adverse/sentinel event. And it was found that, you know what, the guidelines say you should have neuromuscular monitoring and you didn't. So you want to make sure you have the guideline alignment, and then also have precise dosing for the neuromuscular blocking agent, and then of course the reversal side as well. We highlighted all the various risk and adverse effects of receiving too much of any drug. Really, there's no drug that you want to overdose on. So it all comes back to it. You want to make sure you have that train-to-for ratio of 90%. We know that reduces postoperative pulmonary complications by 43% and shorten overall length of stay. And again, nobody really receives the right dose every time unless you have a neuromuscular monitoring, as we saw in that Goldilocks study. So articulating the why is so critical to get buy-in from all involved in the new change. So what do we do and what can we do to help make it easier for institutions across the country? Well, we have put together what is essentially the 8 steps for successful implementation. In fact, Senzime offers this quick guide, if you will, or roadmap to a successful implementation. And so we have these 8 steps that you see on the screen, and we'll unpack each of them one by one here shortly. So the first is really creating your core team, your sort of task force, if you will, within the hospital. And that task force and team, you want to establish goals like, I want to reduce length of stay. I want to reduce residual paralysis. I want to make sure every case receiving neuromuscular blocking agents receive quantitative neuromuscular monitoring. Those are all potential goals. And then once you have those goals, you want to implement a institutional policy, or in some cases called a protocol, that essentially defines the who, which patient, the what, where, when, how, and why. And then of course you want to make sure you have the supplies, so the monitor, the type of sensor you want, the connectivity you want, all of those things. And then that ladders into your workflow. At what time do you want to put the sensor on the patient? When do you want to start monitoring pre or post paralytic administration, which we recommend pre-paralytic if possible. And then also training. We need to make sure everyone involved truly knows how to appropriately and effectively use the monitor. Then you're going to have your go live. What does the first couple of weeks look like post go live? And then the ongoing metrics tracking, especially quarterly and annually, to make sure, are you meeting those goals? Are we following that protocol that has been established? And the third step. So let's unpack each of these for the next 10 minutes, and then we'll open for Q&A. So step number 1, you want to assemble your team, starting with your champion. Oftentimes that can be the chief of anesthesia, or it can be sometimes somebody running the pharmacy. It really can be anyone that is really a true believer and wants to implement change for the better. And that core anesthesia launch team can include your nurse anesthetists, CRNAs, your anesthesia assistants, anesthesia tech. We've had anesthesia tech managers even lead these types of programs. Clinical education, you want to identify your super users that can train the rest of the teammates. And you can also have your operational partners like pharmacy, especially for those drugs, supply chain to make sure you get what you need, biomed and IT to set up, and also ensure electronic health record connectivity and even connectivity to your multi-parameter monitors. And sometimes it's nice to have a project manager to make sure that you stay on time, because if you're not watching it closely, it can take longer than it really needs to. All of it is pretty straightforward and easy to implement. Now, when we go into step number 2, is you want to define your clinical goals. And obviously, I think the most obvious one is you want to eliminate residual paralysis, because it's all about patient safety. But there's also things like, are you meeting the guidelines? Are you standardizing the train of 4 monitoring practice across not just one department, but multiple departments? supporting the right dosing of your rocuronium, your NMDAs, all the way to your reversals like Sugammadex, and even improving documentation of making sure you're getting that 90% train to 4 ratio or greater at time of extubation. So really make sure that your goal ties back to the why. What is the clinical problem we're trying to solve for, and why are we doing it? So once you get those goals, you'll want to basically create a protocol or a policy. And in that policy, and we have basically a kind of fill in the blanks template in our guide that we can offer, is which patients do you want to monitor? Are there specific procedures like robotics, for example? Are there specific areas like the cardiac ORs department? Do you want to start with that and then standardize across to other areas after that? What does monthly NMDA procedure volumes look like? How do you want to dose and reverse, charting frequency, even creating order sets so that anytime you have a patient that meets the protocol requirements, it automatically flags into your ordering system. Let's add the neuromuscular monitoring. So you need to get the sensor on the patient when the procedure starts. Step 4 is ordering the equipment. So you want to work with your supply chain or purchasing department, and even working with biomed. So you want to make sure you have the monitor that you want. Sometimes you can connect through other monitors as well. Which sensors are you monitoring? Mostly your adults, or do you want pediatric? We have different sensors for those patients. How do you want to connect to your multi-parameter monitors, or even maybe just doing a direct connection to your electronic health record like Epic or Cerner or Oracle? Having your patient cable to make sure you have that in every room where there is a monitor. Mounting, we offer a lot of great mounting solutions to make it really work seamlessly in your anesthesia workspace, whether it's on your anesthesia cart, the IV pole, or wherever. It is a very portable monitor, and we offer many great ways to make it as easy as possible to integrate into your workstation. And of course, we have a lot of great in-service tools like Quick Eyes you can hang on that IV pole. We have badge buddies that help with the dosing protocol, and on the other side of that ID badge that you can put on is your sensor placement. We have things like hang tags with troubleshooting. We have a direct line for a quick text support. We have all of these ways because we really want all of our customers to have great success on day one. Step number 5, you want to establish the clinical workflow. So do you want to put the sensor on during pre-op assessment or right before induction? Confirming that single click into the monitor with the touch cord. Are you going to start monitoring before administering muscle relaxants or after? Our monitor supports either, but we recommend doing it before muscle relaxant administration. What does charting and trending look like? What types of data points do you want to capture? And then what does that recovery threshold look like in the handoff, especially targeting at least 90% train to 4 ratio before extubation? And what does that handoff look like when they go into the PACU? And then as you turn over those ORs, even working with the cleaning crew to make sure they properly ensure that the cord is there properly reattached to the IV pole where the monitor is, or however you've got that monitor placed, and then making sure you have the sensors restocked as well. So really addressing the who, what, where, when, how. Now, step number 6 is the training plan. And this is so critical. You want to have your champion communicating the why, like we just did earlier. We have this awesome e-learning platform called Senzime Academy, where we have these 5-minute online learning modules with self-assessment, so you can track, did they show competency with the monitor? We can provide hands-on. We have a whole dedicated team that can go live on site to help with service, sensor placement as you're getting familiar with the technology and also incorporating that into your workflow. Of course, we have checklists for competency checks. And then, of course, make sure that you have kind of the ongoing education, especially if you have new staff coming in, let's say in a year. What does that new onboarding training look like for new staff coming in? All right, step number 7 is the go live checklist, and then any type of post-launch follow-up. So you want to make sure everything's ready to rock and roll. You've got your devices delivered, tested, and mounted. You've got your sensors stocked. Everyone's trained. You've got the connectivity. And then even having your post-launch meeting schedule so you can see, did we do it well? Are there any gaps? And you want to get ahead of those gaps or any points of friction as early as possible. And it really comes down to things like making sure you always have the right sensor placement. Sometimes you do need reinforcements there, making sure you have the right charting. Any stocking, you never want to not have the sensors available. Making sure you have the right cleaning and cord management. We know that can be a barrier if not addressed right off at the beginning. And of course, address any questions that you might see, because this is a new change in clinical practice. And then the last is tracking and reviewing those metrics. Are you meeting your goals? And so you can look at things like the train of 4 monitor usage rate, your average train of 4 ratio at extubation all the way to the PACU arrival. Time to extubation, overall PACU stay, reduction in things like postoperative pulmonary complications or unplanned ICU admissions. And even looking at value metrics like, did you increase or decrease NMPA dosing and reversal? And what did that cost savings look like? Were you able to reduce readmission rates? All of those different things. And the cool thing that we just recently launched is this new platform called Tetra Analytics, where you can take multiple monitors and multiple cases across multiple operating rooms into one single dashboard and get these composite scores so you can see, how am I doing overall as an institution using quantitative neuromuscular monitoring and following the guidelines of, yes, I am waiting until 90% train to 4 ratio for extubation. So we have easy ways to track progress and success. So just to talk a little bit about Tetra Analytics, you can go at the case level and do case reviews in the whole sort of trend view of how deep they went, and then how you were able to redose with the neuromuscular blocking agents to reversal. And then you can see patterns across multiple cases to see, are we getting better and better in following those guidelines, or, oh no, did we go in the opposite direction? Do we need to re-educate or do some troubleshooting? And the cool thing is we have a composite score because we know that's a lot of data across hundreds of cases. So we created this unique thing called train of 4 quality indicator, where you get one score across hundreds of cases, across 100 monitors to see, are we tracking where we need to be across the board? And if not, maybe we need to do some re-education or look at the protocol, for example. And overall, this is conducive to a lot of cross-departmental collaboration and even being able to show from clinician level all the way to the C-suite with true objective data and using the monitor. So we have this resource we can help with our team, and also some self-support tools, whether it's the implementation guide to Senzime Academy or hands-on training and education or clinical support from our field staff. So I know we're right at time for Q&A, so just want to conclude with we're all about being committed to patient safety. That is our #1 goal, and we want to help healthcare institutions across the country and the world, like acute care hospitals and ASCs, to really help improve patient safety. And that can be done with following the guidelines with a quantitative neuromuscular monitor. So before we open up to Q&A, just want to flash this up. Again, Michael Noble here, and if you have any questions or if you're interested in learning more about what we have to offer, please shoot me an email and I can get you in contact with your local representative. So my email is michael.noble@senzime.com, and you can learn more about what we offer at senzime.com. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle so we can move right into our Q&A.
Outstanding, Michael. Thank you very much. I learned a lot today about what you do, and very impressive. So we've got a couple of questions here. Kendall from Iowa, southeastern Iowa. What is the difference between current neuromuscular monitoring and what you do?
Yeah, I love that question. So for those who may not be familiar, whether you're managing a hospital practice or an ASC, is the most common practice is this 2-prong sort of module called a peripheral nerve stimulator, and they're either doing it here or on the arm. And what that does is a very subjective way of monitoring, because it requires a visual look of, do you see twitches? And then you have to kind of calculate how many twitches and then the ratio. And you have 3 people looking at the same person with that peripheral nerve stimulator. Those 3 people will probably give you a different number. So that tells you that is not quantitative and it's very subjective. What we offer is we take out all subjectivity out of the equation. and we provide electromyography or EMG based, and it's measuring the twitches before it even happens. So you can tuck those arms, you even need to look at the patient to get the train to four ratio. And so with that, that really helps to help with clinical accuracy and overall improve patient safety. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much. We've got a question from Soren Broll. What do you think will be the result of introduction of cheaper sucks on patient safety?
Yep, I love that question. So we just saw a couple weeks ago that the first generic version of Senzime. So backstory, Senzime was patented protected by Merck with the Bridion, and so they're able to protect a certain price. Well, they lost that patent this summer, and so that opens the door for generics to come in at a lower price. And I anticipate that initially we're going to see maybe a 20 to 30% price reduction, if not more. And what I suspect will happen is clinical practice will continue. I think they will absolutely continue to use Senzime, but now it's going to be less pressure when looking at cost, if that's even a consideration for some customers or clinicians. It's not necessarily a huge pain point. But I think it's going to continue to support potentially this misconception that Senzime is a silver bullet, when all the literature guidelines, even the manufacturer recommendations say you need to have a neuromuscular monitor. So even if it gets cheaper, that is no substitute for quantitative neuromuscular monitoring. You really need to have both. Still use Senzime, but use it with a quantitative neuromuscular monitor. So hopefully that answers your question, Soren.
Yes, thank you. And we've got one more. Kevin from Pennsylvania. A lot of hospitals like to use Senzime. What is the benefit of using neuromuscular monitoring if we already have that?
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent question. And I definitely don't want to start with continue to use Senzime. It's a wonderful drug. It really helps with patient safety, but definitely caution against using it alone. And as we highlighted in the literature earlier, 87% of patients are receiving too much Senzime. And one of the questions that I love that I actually heard from Soren is, as an anesthesiologist, in what world would you say is okay to overdose on a drug? Why would you want to overdose on a drug? Well, you can't know if you're overdosing or if you're getting the right dosing unless you have a quantitative neuromuscular monitoring guiding that decision, because it's all about making sure you get that train of four ratio of at least 90%. And in some cases, a patient may not even need Senzime, but you don't know unless you have the monitor. So that would be the recommendation. It can help obviously reduce adverse effects associated with it. Also, cost savings, even if they're cheaper, you're still going to save some money. And we know we can always save some money at the hospital or ASC level. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, sir, very much. It looks like that's all of the questions for today in the queue. If you have any additional questions regarding today's topic, please feel free to email Michael or me, and I will share the ask. Thank you again, Michael, and thanks everyone for joining us today. See you at the summit.
Thank you, everyone.